Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The auditorium had been transformed. When Elias entered the building on the morning of the debate, he found that the organizers had constructed something that resembled a theater, a stage with two podiums set at opposing angles, their surfaces polished to a glossy sheen that caught the harsh overhead lights and threw them back at the audience in sharp, unforgiving slivers. The seats had been arranged in concentric arcs that curved around the central platform, and already they were filling with the kind of people Elias had come to recognize: the earnest, the passionate, the desperate, the convinced. They wore their convictions like armor, like badges of honor, like weapons they were prepared to wield against anyone who dared to challenge them. He found Julian waiting for him backstage, the young man's face alight with that fervent intensity that had unsettled Elias so deeply in Chicago. Julian was pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his movements quick and agitated, the energy of a caged animal that had smelled freedom. "Dr. Thorne," Julian said, and his voice carried an electric charge, a current of excitement that seemed to crackle through the air between them. "You came. I wasn't sure you would come." Elias leaned heavily on his cane. The cancer had progressed. The pain was worse now, a constant companion that gnawed at his bones and clouded his thoughts. He had stopped the chemotherapy 3 weeks ago. There had been no point in continuing. The treatments had extended his timeline by a matter of weeks, not months, and the suffering they caused had outweighed any benefit he might have derived from them. He had accepted this. He had accepted the pain. He had accepted the inevitable. But he had not accepted Julian's plan. He had not accepted the logical conclusion of his own arguments, the terrible destiny that his philosophy had been preparing for. "You asked me to come," Elias said, and his voice was flat, exhausted, the voice of a man who had been hollowed out by pain and doubt. "I promised you I would come. I keep my promises." Julian nodded, his eyes never leaving Elias's face. "The debate is going to change everything. Dr. Vasquez is one of the most respected neuroscientists in the country. She's written extensively on the nature of consciousness, the evolution of the human brain, the biological imperatives that drive us. She's going to argue that our philosophy is a pathological response to trauma, a kind of cognitive malfunction that arises from an inability to process certain existential truth. And we're going to dismantle her. We're going to show everyone that she's wrong." Elias studied the young man's face, the flush of righteous certainty that colored his cheeks, the unshakable conviction that burned in his eyes. He had been that young man once. He had been that certain. He had believed with the whole of his being that he had found the truth, that the world was suffering, that the only ethical response was to turn away. And now, standing in the wings of this theater, watching the audience fill the seats, and Julian's excitement build to a fever pitch, Elias felt the full weight of his disillusionment pressing down on him like a physical force. "Julian," he said, and his voice carried a warning he did not know how to articulate. "I need you to understand something. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the philosophy, about the arguments, about where they lead." Julian's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty passing across his features before the certainty reasserted itself. "You're not going to have second thoughts, are you? You're not going to lose your nerve?" Elias shook his head slowly. The movement weighted with a weariness that Julian could not possibly comprehend. "I'm not going to lose my nerve. I'm going to tell the truth as I see it. And the truth, Julian, is that I was wrong about everything." The silence that followed was profound, the kind of silence that seemed to have its own texture and weight, pressing against Elias's skin like a cold compress. Julian stared at him, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, the machinery of his certainty grinding to a halt as it encountered the jagged rock of Elias's confession. "You can't be serious," Julian said at last, and his voice had lost its electric charge, had become something thinner and more fragile, the voice of a man watching his foundation crumble. "You wrote the manifesto. You built the arguments. You spent your entire life proving that we were right." "I spent my entire life proving that I was right," Elias corrected him, and the words came slowly, carefully, as though he were picking his way through a minefield. "And I believed it. I believed it with every fiber of my being, but beliefs can be wrong. Arguments can be flawed. Certainty is not the same as truth. Julian's hands had begun to tremble, the same trembling that Elias had observed in Chicago. But now it was animated by something different. Not passion, but fear. "You're dying," Julian said, and there was an edge of accusation in his voice. "You're dying, and you're losing your faith. You're afraid of death, and you're trying to find comfort in sentiment. You're trying to believe in the very illusions you spent your life dismantling." "I'm not trying to believe in illusions," Elias said, and for the first time in his life, he felt the words he was speaking to be true, in a way that transcended logic, transcended philosophy, transcended everything he had ever built. "I'm trying to believe in the truth. And the truth, Julian, is that I don't know. I don't know if life is suffering. I don't know if joy is an illusion. I don't know if the unborn are better off in non-existence. I don't know. And the uncertainty, the not knowing, is the most honest thing I've ever felt." The debate was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. Elias stood at the side of the stage, watching as the organizers made their final adjustments, as the audience settled into their seats, as the cameras were positioned to capture every angle of the confrontation. He could see Dr. Vasquez on the other side of the stage, a woman of perhaps 50 with silver-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She was speaking to her assistant, making notes on a tablet, her movements calm and unhurried. She was preparing for battle, and she had no idea that Elias was preparing to surrender. Julian had retreated to a corner of the backstage area, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously. The certainty that had animated him in Chicago had been shaken, and he was struggling to rebuild it. Elias watched him for a long moment, watching the young man's desperate reconstruction of his convictions, and he felt a sorrow so profound that it seemed to fill every cavity of his being. He had done this. He had given Julian the words, the arguments, the permission to believe. He had built the edifice that Julian was now frantically trying to defend. Now, standing on the precipice of the debate that would expose all of it, Elias understood that he could not simply walk away. He had to confront the consequences of his life's work. He had to face the monster he had created, the monster that wore his face and spoke with his voice and believed with his certainty. He had to face it, and he had to find a way to destroy it. The moderator called them to the stage. Elias walked slowly, leaning on his cane, the pain in his bones a constant reminder of his mortality. He took his place behind the podium, adjusting the microphone, squinting against the harsh glare of the lights. He could see the audience now, could see the faces of the believers and the skeptics and the undecided. He could see Julian in the front row, his hands clasped together, his face a mask of controlled desperation. Dr. Vasquez began. Her voice was clear and measured, the voice of someone who had spent her life in the service of evidence and reason. She spoke about the brain, the intricate machinery of consciousness that had evolved over millions of years, the biological imperatives that drove humans to seek connection and meaning. She spoke about the science of happiness, the measurable impact of love and community and purpose on human well-being. She spoke about the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find joy even in the face of unimaginable suffering. And then she turned to Elias, and her eyes were kind but probing, the eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering to be fooled by the consolations of philosophy. "Dr. Thorne," she said, "you have built your entire career on the argument that life is suffering, that procreation is a moral wrong, that the only ethical choice is to refrain from creating new life. You have convinced thousands of people that they are right to turn away from the world. But I want to ask you a question, a simple question, and I want you to answer it honestly." Elias nodded. He knew what was coming. He had been preparing for this question since the moment he had returned from Chicago, since the moment he had stood in the hospital corridor and watched his sister hold the hand of a dying child. "If your philosophy is a product of reason," she said, "as you have always claimed, then why does it feel so much like pain? Why does it feel so much like trauma? Why does it feel so much like the natural response of a human being who has been wounded and has never healed? The auditorium fell silent. Elias could hear his own breathing, the rasp of air moving through his failing lungs. He could hear the faint hum of the lights, the rustle of clothing, the soft intake of breath from the audience. "You're right," he said, and his voice came out cracked and raw. The voice of a man who had finally stopped pretending. "You're right. My philosophy is not a product of reason. It's a product of pain. It's the natural response of a human being who was wounded and never healed." The auditorium erupted. Voices rose from the audience, gasps of shock, murmurs of disbelief. Julian was on his feet, his face contorted, his hands raised as though to ward off a blow. Dr. Vasquez was staring at him, her expression unreadable. "Dr. Thorne," the moderator said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "are you saying that you no longer believe in the arguments you have spent your life making?" Elias leaned heavily on his podium. The lights were too bright, the noise too loud, the pain too great, but he forced himself to stand straight, to meet the eyes of the audience, to say the words that had been building inside him for months. "I'm saying," he said, "that the arguments are flawed. I'm saying that I was wrong. About the asymmetry of pain, about the non-consensual gamble, about the certainty of suffering, about joy, about love, about life." He paused, and in the silence that followed, he could hear his own heart beating, could feel the blood moving through his veins, could feel the life that was slowly, inexorably slipping away. "I was wrong about everything," he said, "and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the lives I've influenced. I'm sorry for the children who were never born because of my arguments. I'm sorry for the people who turned away from love because I told them it was an illusion. I'm sorry for the years of silence. I'm sorry for the years of isolation. I'm sorry for all of it." He did not remember the rest of the debate. He remembered fragments, the chaos of the auditorium, Julian's face pale and stricken, the certainty shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, Dr. Vasquez's hand on his arm, steadying him, guiding him off the stage, the flashing lights of cameras, the shouts of journalists, the press of bodies as he was led through a side door and into the relative quiet of a green room. He sat in a chair, and someone brought him water, and someone else asked if he needed a doctor, and he shook his head and said, no, he was fine, he was fine. But he was not fine. He had never been fine. He had spent his entire life pretending to be fine, pretending that his philosophy was a shield, pretending that the walls he had built were protection. And now the walls were down, and he was exposed, and the vulnerability was terrifying. Julian burst into the room. His face was mottled with rage, his hands trembling, his voice shaking with a fury that Elias had never seen in him before. "You destroyed everything," Julian said. "You destroyed the movement. You destroyed the philosophy. You destroyed the one thing that gave meaning to all of us. How could you do that? How could you stand up there and say those things?" Elias looked at the young man, at the desperation in his eyes, the conviction that had been shattered, that was trying to rebuild itself. He looked at Julian, and he felt the weight of everything he had created, everything he had destroyed, everything that could never be undone. "I had to," he said, and his voice was quiet, exhausted. "I had to tell the truth as I see it. And the truth, Julian, is that the philosophy is a lie. It's a beautiful, elegant, seductive lie. But it's a lie, and lies destroy people. They destroy lives. They destroy everything they touch. And I've spent my entire life building a lie. I needed to stop. I needed to stop before I destroyed anyone else." Julian stared at him. The fury in his eyes slowly gave way to something else, something that looked almost like grief. He stood there, trembling, his hands clenched at his sides, and Elias could see the struggle playing out in his face, the desperate attempt to hold on to the certainty that had been his anchor. "You're wrong," Julian said, but his voice had lost its force, had become a whisper, a plea. "You're wrong. You have to be wrong. If you're right, if the philosophy is a lie, then everything I've believed, everything I've done. He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. The words were too terrible to speak aloud. Elias reached out and took the young man's hand. The contact was awkward, unfamiliar. He had never been good at touching, at connecting, at offering comfort, but he tried. "Julian," he said, "I don't know if the philosophy is a lie. I don't know if it's true. I don't know anything. And that's the point. The only honest response to the human condition is uncertainty. The only honest response is not knowing and being willing to admit that you might be wrong." Julian pulled his hand away. He stood there, trembling, his face a mixture of grief and confusion and betrayal. "I believed in you," Julian said. "I believed in you. And you destroyed everything." He turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Elias was alone. He sat in the green room for a long time, staring at the wall, listening to the distant hum of the auditorium. Then he stood up. The pain in his bones was worse now, a constant companion that would never leave him. But he forced himself to walk, to move, to keep going. He walked out of the green room and into the corridor. He walked through the building and out into the street. The city was alive with light and sound and movement. The people were going about their business, living their lives, finding joy and suffering and meaning in the endless, incomprehensible chaos of existence. He looked at them, and he did not judge them. He did not pity them. He did not envy them. He simply saw them, the suffering, the joy, the love, the loss. He saw everything, and he accepted it. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to live.